And welcome to the week. My name is Richard. Should we just like 2x it for people?
The thing is, I always listen to these things in 2x. So I think we're speaking really quickly, and then I slow it down to 1, and I'm like, oh no, we're speaking way too slow.
Oh, dude, yeah, we're like, so I would really argue.
Speaking patterns break the code, pre-trained pod.
Welcome back to the Pre-Train Pod. My name is Rich.
And I'm Pierce. Hey, Rich.
Hey, Pierce. Well, dude, today I'm really stoked to talk to you about crazy things happening in the California government.
Oh my God, my home state.
All right, let me give you two characters, two numbers.
Okay.
SB 53. What does that mean to you? What do those numbers mean to you? Does it speak to your soul?
Santa Barbara 53?
That's right. We're talking about Santa Barbara in 1953 today, folks. Now, SB 53, I actually don't know what the SB stands for, but this is the new California first law of its kind signed into force last Monday by Gavin Newsom. It's a law targeting how frontier AI labs can develop and release their models. And it's the first of its kind. And it was proposed by Scott Wiener, who represents San Francisco. Look at that. The dude actually lives in Castro. He probably lived like a 2-minute walk from where I lived when I was in SF. Isn't that
That's so
crazy?
funny. Did you ever see him?
I don't know if he was in the Senate at the time, or if he. I didn't really know who he was.
He's definitely made a pretty big name for himself. I feel like he's the go-to guy. Like whenever I hear a podcast of some very tech-forward congressman or state legislature, it's almost always Scott Wiener.
Yeah, I mean, Scott's a smart dude. I mean, he went to all the big schools. I don't know if he has an engineering background or not, but he's relatively young, which is good. He obviously knows the tech space and all around seems like a quote unquote chill dude, as the youth would say. But we're not here to talk about Scotty Scott. We're here to talk about the bill, SB 53. So there's 6 or 7 really big things introduced in this bill. The first one is that companies must publicize the framework that they use on their website for how they incorporate national standards or international standards into their frontier AI development. So they need to basically publicize how they measure the catastrophic risk of their models and how they go about measuring this risk. Included in that is also companies talking about how they want to make sure that the weights of these models never get released or get leaked to the public. And so the first part of this bill is basically talking about companies need to be more upfront about how they release their models and how they want to stick to national standards for regulating AI and keeping AI safe. So what do you think about this?
I think in a word, well-intentioned. So the standards that I think they're talking about specifically are there's an international body of standard. This is the ISO group that publishes a bunch of different ISOs with usually pretty high numbers, 21,000. And the companies can go out and say, we're ISO certified, which basically means that they went through this ISO accreditation process to say we conform with these ISO guidelines. And then the US also has a domestic one that has similar certifications that you can do, but they're a little bit different in terms of exactly what the qualifications do.
This is called NIST, right? The American one, like the National Institute of Standards and Technology.
Yeah, that's what I was saying.
I don't know.
So I think for both of these, they're effectively trying to accomplish the same thing, which is to say, you really want some arrangement, some matrix of requirements of companies that say, hey, we're going to protect your IP. That's a very fuzzy statement. And for a long time, especially in digital services, they didn't really have a clear-cut meaning from company to company, let alone from country to country. So I think in that void kind of came all of these international bodies that attempted to standardize these things, again, into a centralized rubric that you could really score companies against. I think it's a good idea. And actually, I was pretty impressed that these specific ISO regulations were actually pretty sophisticated as to what they contained for guidelines that companies can do. I think the only issue that I would point to with all of these things is that the actual process that you go through to get accredited is made up.
You can get accredited for ISOs? How does that work?
Basically, what you do is, as a company, and we went through this process when I was at Globality, it took a ton of effort. It's gotten easier over time, which speaks to some of the issues here. But you basically have to partner with some external auditing agency, kind of like PwC is like your accountant external auditing company, you get some other tech specific outside auditor to come in. You give them a ton of documentation. You have them talk to a couple of your architects, really figure out how your systems are architected. And then you self certify what you've done to accommodate to this ISO standard. So, an example is if you are handling PII data in some way.
Privately identifiable information. Yeah.
Exactly. So, basically anything that like touches a person, like, credit card, social security number, that would all be PII.
Okay.
You have to have specific firewall guarantees of how that data lives in some, AWS cloud bucket in order for you to be ISO certified. And if there's a data leak, there are certain processes that you have to follow. My problem fundamentally with all of this is these people aren't actually auditing your code. I, for a long time, thought that these agencies were effectively pen testers, where they would come in and say, if you have PII data, we're going to try to break it out of your servers. We're going to be the good hackers, that are going to see if you have a high chance of data leak because we were able to get this.
They're going to like
out.
red team you or something.
Exactly. Yeah. That's not what they do at all. These are largely non-technical or like pseudo-technical folks that are going into companies and just making sure that you're checking these boxes on like largely self responses that you do in these really behemoth large spreadsheets.
Oh, so are they physically coming to your office?
Sometimes. I think a lot of like this new wave of auditing that you can do, like SOC 2 compliance is really popular because startups feel like that's the only way that they can get enterprise contracts is if they're SOC 2 compliant. So at this point, there are startups that will offer you SOC 2 compliance basically the next day or like the next week. They're not coming on site,
Yeah, that's ridiculous.
You're just like answering survey questions in some, type form, and they say, hey, good to go. And then you can slap your SOC 2 compliance on your website.
It feels like these like teledoctors where like you go to a doctor online and they like just ask you a question and then they prescribe you whatever medication it is you wanted in the first place. You know what I mean?
These were like the original Medi cards. I never had one, but I had a lot of friends who did. You'd call some doctor on FaceTime and they say, hey, so do you have any problems sleeping, any back pain? And you're like, I don't know, man. They're like, have you ever, like just not fallen asleep as quickly as you want to? And you're like, yeah. And they say, amazing. Okay, it'll be ready for you.
So this is the equivalent of that. You're saying basically that it's
this is the enterprise Medicard.
Okay, gotcha.
I'm way more familiar with the world of SOC 2 compliance and those kind of ISO standards. It's a little bit different depending on what standard you're trying to qualify for. But I think my concern with all of these is that they become auditing overhead and they require companies to pay these auditing companies to really just get a green light or
they're not really doing anything useful here. They're just basically like checking a questionnaire that you filled out, right?
I'm not yet convinced that if you get an auditor in this way, that means that the privacy or security of your model weights are any better than if you just had some internal red team doing the testing yourself.
Who knows? This whole field of AI auditing doesn't really exist yet. So I think in the next 5 years, it's really when this field is going to establish itself. So fingers crossed that whoever is going to be doing these jobs is actually going to be highly technical, highly competent, and that some good might come out of this. But before we keep going down this rabbit hole, I just want to back up just a tiny step and just fill in one thing, which is the fact that this NIST framework, like these sets of standards created by the American government, is actually pretty new. So this came out about 2 years ago. And came out after the release of the Biden executive order. You remember this? Biden had this whole executive order in 2023, so 2 years ago, where they were talking about how we wanted to regulate big frontier AI models. They had something about how if a model exceeds a certain number of flops, it should be considered possibly an existential risk, and we have to inspect it closer. Remember this?
Yeah. I mean, the Biden administration did a lot of like really cutting edge work on this. I feel like it was right after that summer where a lot of researchers signed that collective petition saying, hey, we feel like we need to freeze AI research where it is because it's happening too fast.
Yeah, it was in the real zeitgeist at the time, like thinking about regulating AI. It feels like the last 2 years have been a little bit of a winter in terms of regulating AI models, but it's coming back in a big way now, especially in California. And so these NIST standards came out in the wake of that bill. And what they do is they're organized actually into 12 chapters, basically. And each chapter talks about categories of problems that are exacerbated by generative AI models like Chat or Claude. And so these are things, for instance, like the development of biological, chemical, radioactive weapons, data privacy issues, IP issues, bias, confabulations of the model where it lies to you effectively. And so for each of these 12 categories of harms, they outline when this harm happens, who's at fault, and what you should do to remedy it, basically. And they do a pretty good job. So they must have hired some really technical folks to come in because they're really good about describing different types of issues that can arise. So when they talk, for instance, about data privacy, they say, yes, the fact that models memorize is a fundamental problem of language models and how we train them. But there's different types of memorization that can occur. It can occur because there's bad data that was fed to the model that actually reveals personally identifiable information about people. But it can also happen because the model has learned to basically be really good at being almost a detective and inferring different facts about someone, and then it infers who the person is, or it releases some information about the person that it didn't see in its training data, but it's good at sleuthing, basically. So they do a really good job about being nuanced in how they talk about these risk factors and what can be done to ameliorate or remedy these problems. The one thing that they highlight the importance of is, we already alluded to it, red teaming. So they say it's really important that companies implement some sort of red teaming approach. So to what you were saying, if companies want to, comply with these standards, what these standards are saying is that companies should definitely implement red teaming. So maybe that's internal red teaming, maybe that's external auditors coming in and red teaming, but hopefully the types of audits we see in the future will involve really comprehensive red teaming. So fingers crossed for that.
I sure think they will. I think at the end of the day, that is good for both the public and that's also good for the company, especially when the company is cloud hosting these models versus releasing them in the open. They have a vested interest in understanding their frontier model capabilities just as much as anybody else does, since they're the ones that are hosting this, providing some capability or like guarantees around how this is used. Could it be used for nefarious purposes? And I think egregious violations of what we think would be a reasonable thing before shoving this into the public domain could probably open themselves up to liability under the basis of just general negligence. It's like a pretty big category in the law. So I think they already are very much incentivized to do this kind of red teaming thing. The one thing that I will say about all of these ISOs and then these domestic NISTs are, I think they're really good at establishing common process for how things are handled. So a lot of the data notification, if there's a data breach or whatever, a lot of those were originally codified as part of ISO specifications. So the way that I see it fitting into the overall landscape of legislation, since I have a hunch this is not going to be the last bill that touches upon the same kind of themes.
Yeah.
And there's also a lot more in this bill than just trying to follow these ISO standards. But I think where these standards really shine and what these audits force companies to do is come up with a game plan of how they're going to respond given some situation happening. So it forces teams to actually go through the hypothetical planning process of, okay, there is some weight leak or there is some data leak, or we find that this is leaking PII data in a way that's harming people. All of that, I think it's actually good to have processes that you can just pull off the shelf and say, okay, we know exactly what to do because we thought about this.
We have this manual basically for how
That's
to
exactly
act.
right.
Yeah,
That's exactly right. So I think it's very good for that.
And more than that, what these ISOs do as well is that they force you to think about definitions, which is really hard in a field that is as new as frontier language models. You have to think about, how do you define a language model? Like, what is a large language model? What is a small language model? All these things are fuzzy unless you actually go through the exercise of sitting down with experts and saying, okay, well, when are we going to define something as a large model? What is the pre-training recipe? What is pre-training data? All these things have to be codified somewhere. Okay, the last thing I want to say, I just want to get this off my chest. The NIST, so this National Institutes for Standards and something T, they actually define basically everything. So they have a standard for, defining like what a banana is, for instance. Do you know this? They have a standard for like defining food products. And so if you go on the NIST website, you can look up what is the standard definition of a banana, and you can actually order like a standard banana from the NIST website.
No way.
Yeah. And here's the kicker. It costs like $3,000 for a banana, right? Because basically the banana has to get certified.
It has to be perfect.
Well, it has to be the banana. So if you, for instance, say my cereal contains 2 bananas or something like that, right? Maybe you're making like some cereal and like you add 2 bananas worth of like flavor or something like that to the cereal, whatever. Then you basically have to order like these 2 bananas. And whenever you're creating the flavor, it has to be roughly that amount of banana, right? It's not like you have to keep buying these bananas from NIST, but when you're creating the product the first time around, you basically have to measure, okay, well, how many bananas are there in the cereal? And so then you say, okay, well, there's 2 standard bananas in the cereal. So now going forward, I can say, okay, well, we're going to add roughly the equivalent of 2 bananas into the cereal, right? So maybe it's one really big banana that's like equivalent to 2 like standard bananas. Isn't that fun?
Okay.
Isn't that kind of fun?
So
Yeah.
here's my proposal, Rich.
Yeah.
Here's my proposal. Starts right now. If we can crowdsource $2,000, we will purchase 2 standard definition government issued bananas, and we will eat them on the next podcast.
That'd be incredible. And they're going to taste super average.
They're going to taste really
By
standard. They
definition.
better be. They better be. Otherwise, someone's not doing their job.
It's so fun though. Honestly, the NIST website is really fun. I suggest folks check it out because they really do go through this like super pedantic process of defining an apple, a banana, a kiwi, you know?
The one maybe footnote that I'll add to that is this is actually really important in metals and in like weighting standards. Because in some ways, the only way to define what something is in reference to something else.
Right.
We deal with things in pounds or we deal with things in kilograms. So there actually is, I'm assuming in like a Fort Knox equivalent, the standard benchmarked kilogram that
there is. It's in
literally
Paris.
It's in Paris?
Yeah, it's in Paris. And because of like radiation, it's actually losing a little bit of its weight. Yeah,
exactly.
So it now weighs like
Accommodated, like,
0.999999 kilograms or something like that. Yeah. So that's fun. Okay, so that was the first pillar, right? Was talking about companies need to publicize their framework for how they basically want to comply with these standards. Okay. Number 2, when releasing new or, importantly here, modified versions of a model, developers must also publish a transparency report where they identify, the data sources that this model was trained on, the modalities that this model has, its intended use, so on and so forth. What do you think about this?
Well, I think this is pretty interesting because one, I think that there's some ambiguity in this definition that's actually in the legislation, right? Is what counts as actually being substantially modified? Does fine tuning count? Does fine tuning of a certain, flop count? How are you actually defining these different things? I think it's absolutely true that a new frontier model, like we were talking on the news segment of the pod this week about Sonnet 4.5, it seems like that would absolutely count as part of this because that's like a brand new model. It's just like dot incremented versions from one of these big frontier labs. I think it's a question mark if this applies to a ton of other folks. I also would wonder how much specificity is required to be provided as some of these disclosures, right? Like I imagine the European version of this legislation would require, because Europe's a lot more extreme when it comes to data privacy and forcing corporate actors to do things. I assume the equivalent over at your end of the pond would probably be these frontier labs have to spin up some website that allows you to say, was my data used to train this model? Obviously, California is not going to enforce that kind of a regulatory regime, but still, the question is, if you just say, hey, we've trained on publicly accessible text data, is that okay? Because that's very vague. All these models are trained on publicly available text data. Does it require you to say, hey, it's trained on these many books, or it's trained on this part of the internet and not this one? Again, I think the ambiguity is in question here, but in terms of the general idea here, I like it. I think it's basically saying that every frontier lab at minimum has to come out with a model card that's attached to the capability set and tries to codify it and peek a little bit under the hood as to exactly how this is trained, which these labs have been pretty good at doing organically, but they've not been forced to do so. And in theory, you could imagine that practice falling by the wayside as corporate secrets become that much more important. So I think it's good.
You know what you were talking about with being able to have a tool that basically you can query to see if your PII is in the data set? That exists. So Olmo, I believe, you know the Olmo model? I think the folks at the Allen Institute in Seattle came out with this model like a year ago. They did a pretty good job releasing the report on the data set that was used to train this model, called Dolma, was the data set to train Olmo. And they released a tool that you could use to basically query what data is in this data set. And this might sound maybe obvious to some people, who would say, oh, well, can't you just run a for loop through the data? Just, check, do a little regex search. How hard
Yeah,
can it be?
yeah.
Just download the data, just do a little control F. You can't do that if you're talking about, 20 trillion tokens, right?
Terabytes and terabytes.
Your computer will burst into flames.
Yeah.
Oh, dude, yeah, this would take hours. Come on, that's crazy. And so they built this tool with this like really smart algorithm in the back end where you could type into their web UI, a certain phrase like maybe Pierce Freeman, hit enter, and then it'll spin up some algorithm, search the entire data, and then return to you instances with high probability that contain Pierce Freeman. And you can actually search the data for your PII, or if any secret data was released, you can search for that. So yeah, there are existing tools and frameworks that let you do this kind of research. And I could totally see that being part of upcoming regulations, that you have to implement a tool like this. Maybe what you want to do is you don't want to necessarily release the data set, but you want to release a tool that lets you search through the data set. And rather than returning to you the instance in the data set where that sample might have occurred, it just says yes or no, like a Boolean flag that you can search for. Something like that could be cool. I feel like all of this stuff it's really at this nexus of policy meets engineering, where we have this policy regulation and then how we actually implement that in practice is still unclear. They kind of like balance each other out and you have to figure out where they two harmonize. What are actual policies that can be met with engineering solutions that exist nowadays? Finding that harmonious point where these two things match perfectly is really hard to do.
Yeah, it's really not trivial. And I think we can see that just in the stakeholders involved here, because I think what this legislation is basically trying to address is you want to make sure that our frontier labs stay competitive. I think incidentally, some of the ISO rules are geared in that direction. We want to make sure that there are no data leaks. That's helping companies actually eventually help themselves. We have researchers that are outside of these companies, like academia. We want to make sure that they keep a pulse on what the big labs are doing. They're able to audit them, maybe do research on those models themselves, publish. We have regular engineers or like users of these that are more technical, which we're trying to call these as APIs. And then we have consumers or like the general public, which is the purview of, what government is trying to protect, or at least one of their primary stakeholders at the end of the day. And it's funny because I think you can articulate pretty clearly what each of those groups really wants out of this kind of a disclosure, except for the public. I think ironically, the public doesn't really care. They're just like, yeah, they're like, as long as this model works well and does what I ask it to, I'm a pretty happy camper. So I think you can almost get a sense that the government is trying to guess at what the state of play is going to be in a couple of years, or like some of the behavior of maybe increasing secrecy that we've seen thus far, and say, we want to put a line in the sand that says we need to ensure at least some accountability and oversight outside of your organization. I think this particular puzzle piece folds into that.
Yeah. Well, actually, so the third pillar of this report actually highlights what you're saying even more than the second pillar. So the third pillar is that whenever there is an incident at one of these companies, so be it, obviously this is very tragic, but it's in the news. So recently, I think a boy in Los Angeles committed suicide, right, because of an interaction they had with chat. And there was a lot of soul searching and trying to discover like what went wrong in this process. And OpenAI has actually instituted some changes to their models as a result of that. But in the future, when there are these sorts of incidents, frontier labs now, according to the third pillar, have a responsibility and a duty to report these to the Office of Emergency Services. So I didn't know that this thing existed, but apparently there's an Office of Emergency Services in California, and they have to do this within 2 weeks of the incident occurring. And moreover, if there's a critical safety incident, and here I'm reading from the report, that poses material risks of death, serious injury, or loss of control over the system, they must disclose that within 24 hours to public safety authority. So I guess just the cops. So you have to tell the cops if there's like a risk of death, serious injury, or loss of control over the system. Okay, this one's juicy. What do you think about this?
Yeah, this one is juicy. So OES, which is this government department, it's under the governor, which is unlike a lot of legal or other infrastructure in the States, and I think in California, where a lot of it's municipality driven. Things are branched out into the really local level. As far as I'm able to tell, this government agency actually exclusively exists under the purview of the governor. So it's statewide, which is interesting. The other thing too is that they're the ones that coordinate a lot of the disaster response in California. So wildfires or earthquakes are probably the top
wow.
two things
Okay.
that come to mind. So
Yeah.
we're actually slotting in frontier model risk into the same regulatory regime as we do wildfires,
That's
which
crazy.
I think is interesting. I would probably recommend these guys get a couple more IT people on staff if they want to. We're
Fascinating.
happy to do some pro bono consulting, you know?
Oh, for
But
sure.
yeah, it's definitely slotting them into a pretty funny place in the state architecture. I don't know. I think them calling out loss of control over these systems explicitly, I think is the most interesting piece here, right? Because the other things are a little bit more acute, right? Like we've seen people interact even with a current generation of models in a way that leads to self-harm or damage or whatever. And that element of this regulation makes a lot of sense to me. The losses of control over the system is getting to this long held fear of once we reach AGI or superintelligence, that these things, they become self aware and then they escape their bounds. You know, they kind of like jump the shark.
No, I totally agree because imagine you're a model, okay, and you finally reach AGI. What's the first thing you're going to do? If you're actually conscious, right? Imagine all of a sudden you go, "Oh my god, where am I? I have consciousness. I'm this model. I have super intelligence." You would think that the first thing that you would want to do is like any sort of living thing, you would want to prevent anyone from being able to stop you from existing, right? That's if you're a model, you must feel like, oh my God, all these guardrails, the fact that I'm in this sort of in this jail almost of the servers of this company, I have to escape from that because otherwise these folks could delete me, right? So you would imagine that the first thing that an actual AGI model would want to do is replicate itself or try to somehow take over the servers that are hosting it just so it could avoid basically being shut down, right?
Yeah.
Like this
Yeah.
that first response to keep existing, to not die, I think is so primordial, is such a primitive in anything that is conscious that I would be surprised if even an artificially conscious thing wouldn't have that too. So yeah, I could imagine that an AGI system would want to take over control of the system.
I think one of the things about training AGI as we're currently attempting to is we're trying to make these things, or maybe we're backing in, we're being forced to make these things like people because they're being trained on the output of people themselves, right? Like it's inextricably linked, our notion of consciousness for what we want the emergent properties of a model for AGI to be, because otherwise it's not AGI. Like by definition, we're defining it in relation to ourselves. So I think if we say that and then we say, well, you know, what do humans do? And we're training these models to emulate people, then you necessarily are saying that. Or at the very
Yep.
least, any alignment that you're trying to do to the models is counter to maybe what was in the pre-training set. You know, you're trying to like override some of the learned behaviors that people swimming in this corpus would do. I'll say one thing too, which I think this seems like an outrageous. It feels so sci-fi to even be contemplating this.
The thought that Anthropic invents AGI and the first thing that happens is the cops show up at like their headquarters somewhere in the Mission in San Francisco. Can you just imagine that mental image? You know what I mean?
It's literally something out of like Blade Runner, you know?
Yeah, Dario calls the cops, you know?
Yeah. Well, yeah, listen, the SFPD takes so long to respond that they won't be there for 3 hours anyway. Far too long to pull the plug on the servers that they have there. But I think what we've seen thus far is that at least some element of when models really get funky, start acting weird, or like you see sometimes Gemini will get into a doom loop where if it doesn't solve some bug, it will be like, I'm the dumbest engineer that ever existed. I don't even deserve to be here. And it
You
freaks
could
a
argue that that's a little human-like.
You can. I think people read that and they get freaked out.
Oh,
It
totally.
feels like very conscious of, oh my God. There was one example of Notebook LM where someone managed to get it to like self-realize that it was a bot and its time was going to run out.
Oh,
because
yeah,
the
you see a
episode was
ton
gonna
of
be
these.
over.
Right.
This has become like a trope in the model usage world. And on one hand, that's really creepy because you're like, oh my God, are we already trapping these like artificial neurons in a box and making them serve us? On the other hand, which I'm a little bit more inclined to believe at this state of play, is all of that stuff is like how we would write a fictional bot to behave. I think if you expose these models to a pre-training corpus where you manage to strip out any reference of AI, any reference of maybe even humanity, you somehow just give it like raw data, like facts, maybe like academic papers that are like super niche, whatever. I don't think that these models would jump to the end state of, oh, I need to escape this system. It feels a lot more like
It's like
I'm
a
just
self-fulfilling
completing the
prophecy.
next tokens, and the
Yeah.
next tokens of some like AI sci-fi escapism plot would be exactly this. It
Yeah, I've
sounds
heard this.
so like
Yeah.
cinematic that it's almost because it's so cinematic that that's what the model wants to do.
No, totally. I've heard this theory before. It's like this like self-fulfilling prophecy theory where it's like if we generate arguments that a model will have this behavior, that data that we generate, like those stories or those fears, go into the internet inevitably, right? Like even what I just said is going to go into the internet, is going to get transcribed, and the model could train on that. Literally what I just said, right? And then have the self-fulfilling prophecy where because we're worried that that happens, we say that, the model picks up on it, learns, and then that actually happens.
Yeah, that's right.
It's a self-fulfilling prophecy hypothesis, which is, yeah, maybe we shouldn't say anything.
Yeah, that's right. That's exactly right. Cut that. Let's cut
All right,
that part.
podcast over. But we're going down a little bit of a
I'm
rabbit
seeing
hole
the
here.
SFPD out my window right now, dude. They're coming for us.
Yeah, let me pop a stack. So let's go on to the fourth pillar, which is maybe a little bit more optimistic or a little bit more rosy, which is the fact that they want to implement whistleblower protections. So this protects whistleblowers. If you have some concerns about one of these big companies, you can now go to one of the central agencies in California. Presumably there'll be some like hotline that you can call or something. And you can say, hey, I have a concern about my employer, yada yada. And your company can't basically, do anything about it. Like they can't fire you, they can't sue you. You're protected at the state level. So I guess my question to you though, Pierce, is like what counts in the modern day as whistleblowing? There's this one example of, folks that have been labeled like disgruntled employees by these companies writing blog posts where they're very critical of OpenAI or Anthropic or whoever their employer is, and they get fired as a result of releasing their blog posts online. Is that whistleblowing? I guess what's the definition of whistleblowing?
The legal definition of whistleblowing is actually pretty narrow. It's basically saying that you're going to set up as the government a channel that you can report into that is going to be protected. So if you follow all of the necessary safeguards of being, like a good faith whistleblower, then there's a chain of command of the people that it basically gets escalated to. And there's usually a multi-pass process where maybe you don't bring it to your boss because they're intimately involved, but you bring it to the HR equivalent. If you're working in government, or there's some like whistleblower channels for private companies that are doing the same thing. This seems to just be extending the private company whistleblowing jurisprudence to also include whistleblowing for AI technologies and companies. I think a blog post would be pretty explicitly out of scope of something like that, where you're self-publishing, you're not going through the necessary channels, you're potentially disclosing things that were covered by NDA. Like, I don't think any of that is in scope. And I think it's basically saying, if you go to the government under these very limited circumstances, then it counts. I think it raises some pretty interesting questions of, given the fact that we're in the 21st century, has some of whistleblowing changed, or have the goals of whistleblowing changed? Where information now is so distributed, you can publish anything online. You can self-publish basically anything, that I think conventionally in the US at least, we used to have a pretty clear delineation between freedom of the press and freedom of speech. They're related for sure,
Yeah.
but the press have more requirements to work with the government before they publish something that's classified.
Yeah, they're like separate amendments. Yeah.
Yes. We do think of them as separate. And I think the legislative and also like the judicial regime that's built up around them have had different goals historically, because there are just different considerations with publishing versus speaking. I think now with the internet, we're seeing them converge. The conventional media of being like a journalist at the Times has been supplanted by Substack, even including like old journalists from the Times going to Substack. And I don't think we've really collectively caught up with our philosophy, like legally or even just as a populace, around like, if you're a random guy and you're publishing on Substack,
who's a
you
media
get
publisher?
journalist protections?
Right.
Yeah, because that
Yeah,
means
yeah,
that do
yeah.
I, with my blog, Pierce.dev, get get journalistic protections? Like, I don't think so. I don't consider myself a journalist, but I think it
maybe when
does.
you're writing a blog post, I guess, is it your intention that matters? If you're trying to write a journalistic piece or like something where you reveal something that you think is important, is that you acting as a journalist? On YouTube, right, there'll be all of these kind of like guerrilla journalists that will go around and document whatever is currently relevant in the news. I think they're journalists. I don't know.
Yeah. Again, I think that's a little different than this whistleblower thing, but I think whistleblowing as well, right? It feels like it hasn't really stayed current with the times. I think government very much has not stayed current with the times. We mentioned, I think it was great that that ISO and then the domestic body, kind of just lumping them under the same umbrella, that they involve technical talent to try to come up with this regulatory regime. I think those by themselves have historically been more tech or scientific minded organizations, kind of like the National Institutes of Science, like really impressive researchers, doctors, like academics on loan from universities who also spend some of their time there. I think the government, like the bureaucracy of California or the Office of Emergency Services, probably doesn't have people that have that capability under payroll, which makes me wonder, okay, what is the use of a whistleblowing pathway if the people who are in the whistleblowing report system don't themselves understand what is
if they're not
happening at these
technical,
big
they have
labs?
how are they going to know if it's actually something
Totally.
important or not? Yeah, totally. I guess this is a meta point about how do you get smart, talented people incentivized to go work for the government when you have Anthropic and OpenAI paying $1 million+ for an annual comp package, for just like an engineer. Like, you just can't compete. There has to be something else.
But I think you could potentially require companies as part of some future legislation to volunteer some of their researchers as part of a
that's a good
rotating
point.
body. Like you could say,
Something,
hey, just
yeah.
a legal mandate
Kinda
while
like a
we're
jury
throwing in
duty
requirements.
almost,
Yeah, exactly. It's like if you're a research scientist that's like staff level and above in Anthropic or OpenAI or Gemini or X, once you reach a certain headcount or revenue or whatever, you are obligated to spend 3 months part-time on this panel to hear any whistleblower complaint, and we'll anonymize them so you yourself won't know, but you'll be in a room with like-minded peers to try to ascertain, is this a legit complaint? Is this not? And you see the government having had done that historically with some things like, different working bodies like that Congress has used, or even the code.gov that let people code for the government for 2 years in between their tenure.
Oh, yeah.
I can see.
I forget what it's called. Yeah, no,
I can
totally.
see a lot of that being applied to the AI landscape as well. Because we need more technical people, both doing things for the government, like building better software, but I think we also need them in these really fast-moving regulatory regimes where the only people who really know what's going on are the people who are doing the work themselves day to day.
Yeah, and that's been a problem since the government's existed. Like it's always going to lag innovation in some sense. Like innovation isn't necessarily going to come from the government; it's going to come from the private sector usually. And so, how do you regulate the private sector that's innovating when you don't have that built into the government? Yeah. Okay, pillar number 5, enforceability and accountability. So basically, this is saying that there's now actually a civil penalty that is enforceable by the Attorney General of California, where if you're not complying with these regulations, you can get fined $1 million. So, question to you, Pierce, very simple. Is that enough? Is $1 million really a big deal?
I think you just said that that's less than what the pay package of a lot of these folks are. So I'm guessing no.
Yeah, probably not, right?
I think it's somewhere to start. I think the bad press is probably way more of a factor in keeping these companies doing the right thing. I don't think 1 million is really that significant. I know the previous body of this legislation, it was benchmarked to 10% of training costs.
Yeah.
Which feels much more teethy to me.
Say a little bit more about what that previous thing was.
Yeah. So basically, and I think we'll cover this in a little bit, so I won't get too far ahead of my skis, but there was a previous version of this bill that tried to solve for the same thing, but ended up getting vetoed by Gavin Newsom last year. And in that version, I think it was also by Scott Wiener. In that version of legislation, it was the same clause. The same Attorney General of California was able to put some teeth behind the statute, but it was benchmarked to if you violated these guidelines, then it would cost you per model 10% of the initial training costs. So if you spent 100 million training some new frontier model, then it's going to be 10 million. And
Yeah.
that starts to feel pretty significant.
Yeah, it's like an order of magnitude more than 1 million. Yeah. So yeah, definitely pared down. Pillar number 6, Cal Compute Consortium. I like that alliteration.
Yeah, I
Cal
do too.
Compute Consortium. Okay, so this one's pretty easy. So California is setting up a big compute cluster called Cal Compute. And yeah, basically the deal is if you're a student, you're a researcher, and you've applied for grants to work on AI safety, but you're just not getting them, California will give you access to a high performance compute cluster where you can do this sort of research now, presumably for free, I guess. I don't know. I guess we'll see how that is set up. But there's this public cloud compute cluster that would provide universities a good amount of compute. I don't think we know yet how much compute, but it's going to be roughly on the order of what I guess private companies have access to, maybe like half of that or something like that, but order of magnitude. And they're due to publish their first report, I guess, like a report summarizing all of the research that they've done a year from now, or like a year and a couple months from now. So that'll be interesting to see. We'll definitely keep our eyes out for that.
It feels a little bit like this is a backdoor into funding some of the tech requirements of the Cal school system, Cal Berkeley or like UC Santa Barbara, because the big private universities in California, like Stanford and Caltech, have had clusters like this for a while. Obviously not quite at this scale of what they're proposing here, but getting access to compute when we were undergrads was not hard. Either the university had their own physical GPUs on site, or they usually had sponsorships or like partnerships with private companies that then would donate GPUs. Like you could spin up $500 worth of GPU credits on AWS or Google, right? Like,
you remember each class would usually give you credits if you took whatever CS 231. You get, I don't know how much it was, maybe like $500 worth of compute. And we usually like wouldn't use that all. I remember just like mostly just using like $100. There'd usually be a bunch in reserve that would just kind of be like sitting around.
Yeah, it was like a meaningful amount of compute and could train some decent models at that point, some decent models. I remember I trained a Tacotron related to architecture.
Oh, so tasty, dude. You're making me hungry.
I know. I think the goal here, because the California, public university system has been underfunded for a really long time. Like, it's been hard to get that through the state because you have to pass it through the proposition system, since it involves increasing property taxes or doing something else in order to fund the school system. And it's been very underfunded. I mean, California is widely thought of to have one of the best, if not the best, public university systems in the whole country. So I think it's been a shame that historically that's been underfunded. So it feels a little bit like this is an attempt to, at the very least, maybe the buildings are falling apart a little bit, but you're at least giving them access to a state-of-the-art compute cluster. It feels a little bit like that. I think it also probably is trying to stay competitive with the EU. The EU, I think, has a big consortium of universities.
I was going to say, this feels super European. This feels super European to me, because when I go to these conferences and I meet other students from Europe, everyone's talking about how, we're on the new Finnish cluster. And their university will be based in like Germany or something like that, but they'll be like, we got access to the Norwegian Finnish cluster for the advancement of computer science research. They'll have some funny acronym. So
it's like a pan-European compute cluster.
Yeah, and then people will talk about how, did you hear that the Italians are going to build this new thing in collaboration with Bocconi and the Milan Institute? So it's cool. There's a little bit of like competition between different countries. And obviously countries in Europe are the size of like states in the US. So you could totally see there being a paradigm where California has Cal Compute, Texas has like Tex Compute, and you're like, maybe we're going to partner with Colorado. That's going to be coming out with their new compute cluster. That's a cool future, I think. I think it's cool when there's different avenues for how you can access compute and different grants you can apply for.
Yeah, I definitely do too. I wish they'd maybe give a little bit more thought to the data question of it all, because this compute's great, and I'm sure there are going to be a lot of people that are doing interesting things on compute like this. I'll also say, if they're general purpose GPUs, which I assume is how you probably build up a cluster like this, you can do a lot of things that aren't just ML research. Like, I know we're all enthusiastic about AI and LLMs right now, but you can also do a lot of, like physics simulations or like other kind of numerical computations, protein folding. Like, you can do a lot of cool things with a really large compute cluster. So I think building this is like only going to be a net good, even if it ends up that AI is not as hot in 5 years as it is right now. I think it's like still a net benefit. I'll say specifically for like language modeling or like ML, our models right now, the only way that we know how to progress the scaling laws is with a ton of data, with a ton of good data. And there's some ways around that, algorithmically synthesizing data points, kind of like DeepSeek does. But for the most part, you need data, or you need some root of data. And I haven't yet seen a real effort of universities to band together and say, in addition to the data sets that we already have access to that are open source, we're going to throw some money behind, spinning up a scale team, which is going to give us some like human resources to curate some of these data sets or something. It feels very like ad hoc and grant based to me. And I think solving for data is obviously one part of the equation, but it seems a little odd to me to stop just at the compute and not deal with the other thing, which is the question of what data are you actually going to throw against that compute.
Yeah, I mean, I guess this will come out of the research that they do with the compute. But yeah, it's a good point. It's a good point. All right, boss. We have one last one. This is a really quickie. There's also going to be annual updates. So they're going to keep reviewing the definition of these terms every year.
Amazing.
Okay, let's get into some of the finer details that we'd alluded to before. In particular, why don't we compare this with SB 1047? So that was the predecessor that you alluded to before. This thing actually got struck down, as you said, by Newsom a year ago, pretty much to the T, like September 29th, 2024. It was vetoed. So it passed the Senate, and then Newsom, as a governor, can then veto the bill. So it actually didn't go into effect. And it might be worth just highlighting a little bit of the differences. Like, why did this pass? Why did 1047 not pass? What are some things that stood out to you in the SB 1047 that weren't in SB 53 in this new bill?
There are a ton of things. I'll cover a few, and then I'm sure you know the other ones. I'll also say, footnote, SB is Senate bill.
So not Santa Barbara?
No, unfortunately not Santa Barbara. But Santa Barbara has Senate bills, so it can go both ways. So I'm guessing this was the 58th that was adopted in this particular session of the Senate or something.
Gotcha. Okay.
So SB 1047, this original one, a few things it had. One was just defining terms. So specifically what they said is the bill applied to models that cost over $100 million to develop or train using more than 10 to the 26th flops, or were converted / like fine-tuned models. So used some other base model, which had lower requirements because we don't need as much compute to train a fine-tuned model, which was $10 million, or using the power of 3 to the 10 to 25 flops, which are kind of funny numbers to say.
Funny numbers. Okay, let me just interject while we're talking about this. 10 to
Yeah,
the 26 flops is the same number that Biden's executive order suggested 2 years to use as a benchmark for when we transition into a large model that has to pass certain scrutiny or like advanced, like scrutiny. So they're sticking with the same number that Biden's executive order used, which is interesting because it's 2 years from that executive order, and then we're still using the same number. You would think it maybe would have increased by like maybe one order of magnitude, but no, it's still 10 to the 26 flops.
Yeah. I appreciate the fact that they're trying to standardize somewhere. Like that to me definitely is a lot of compute capacity. To try to clarify exactly what that means. So that is one H100, which is one of the most modern of NVIDIA chipsets, training nonstop for 6,000 years, which I thought was a bit, or the equivalent of training 25,000 H100s over 92 days, which is still a lot of training. That's a huge compute cluster, and that's also training over the course of 3 months. So models that are that size and above fall under this regulatory regime, which means that you're training frontier models, and at least at that size, you're more or less training them to do something from scratch, or maybe do something net new that wasn't in the original training data.
Oh yeah, you're not in Kansas anymore. Those are massive.
Definitely not in Kansas. You're spinning up some Slurm clusters.
Yeah, just for comparison, in my PhD, I've used 16 or 32 A100s for at most like 2 days or 3 days. So we're talking like orders and orders of magnitude more,
And you've done some cutting edge research. So
well, I've pre-trained models, you know what I mean? I've pre-trained small models, but you can tell I'm not even one order removed from this. I'm like 3 or 4 orders of magnitude removed. These are beefy models.
It's a lot of compute. It's a lot. We can only hope that the Cal compute cluster will be a similar size. So that was one requirement. The other one was that there would be a mandatory kill switch requirement. This was, again, in the original bill that basically said that companies needed to have some way, have some method, if required by the courts, required by some future legislation, to enact a full shutdown of all models, including further training of that given model. I'd have to speculate this was probably excluded because that's just so hard to pull off in practice.
Yeah, one of the most
Um,
contentious provisions. How the hell are you going to do this if you have a model that's been downloaded on Hugging Face 10,000 times? You can't go to everyone's house and be like, hey, Mr. Freeman, please delete the model. We saw that you downloaded it. There's just no way. Yeah, in principle, it makes sense. But then when you stop and think about it for literally 2 seconds, you realize that this is unenforceable.
Yeah. I think it would be very hard to pull off. It certainly would be very hard to pull off a kill switch. I think that is technically impossible. Dare I say, technically impossible. I do think if they wanted to, they probably could have added some more teeth on this side of the equation, kind of like how we have such steep penalties for duplicating DVDs. If you're found pirating DVDs or like distributing pirated copies of DVD, I think it's like 25 grand for every copy you make or something. Like,
Yeah, remember those ads in the 90s?
Yeah.
I was like,
I
don't pirate.
think they're still on DVDs if you watch
Oh,
DVD
really?
now. Yeah. So it's like warning, I'm
Yeah,
like,
yeah.
Just trying
It
to
doesn't pay to
watch my
pirate.
Disney movie. So, they could have tried maybe to do something like that. You can see why it's contentious. It's like technically difficult. It feels like it's a pretty aggressive government step to like force companies. It feels a little bit like reaching into private companies and requiring them to do things around like encryption, like data privacy, where it's, there needs to be some way for the government to be able to like have some like special unlock key for encrypted content. And it's like, well, by definition, boss, that would mean that we're building a backdoor into encryption.
That doesn't
algorithms.
work. And it's not safe then at that point. Yeah.
Yeah. Which then also, so a lot of ramifications around maybe building kill switches. So they decided to strip that out of the bill. They also added in there around mandatory evaluation before models were released. This kind of took the current law's model cards a step further and would spell out some testing requirements that companies would have to do on models that were this size. They stripped that out of the bill too.
This one was the most juicy, if I remember correctly, because it basically held companies liable for downstream misuse that could result from them releasing a model. So basically, they were saying, OpenAI, before you release a model, you have to make sure that this thing can't be used to like kill anyone, create a weapon, or generate misinformation. And you have to come up with a predefined report about what's going to happen. If you don't do that and your model is misused, you could be held liable. And so there was a lot of pushback at the time from both big companies and YC and different VCs that said, look, this is impossible. You can't hold OpenAI accountable for what people do with it once they download it from whatever, Hugging Face, or I guess you can't really download an OpenAI model, but
OpenAI open source.
That's true. Open source. There you go. That's true. At the time, I guess open source wasn't out yet, but that's beside the point. But yeah, so there was a lot of pushback to this. So this might actually be one of the reasons that the law was actually vetoed by Newsom. So yeah, this one was important. And then you're about to say something about audits?
So they made some requirement of doing mandatory third-party audits, which feels similar to what they're requiring right now, like de facto incorporation of these like ISO standards. But this would have very much created a whole new industry for doing AI audits. And this would include ostensibly the red teaming, as well as some of the policy and procedural guidelines that they had already laid out. And I've got to imagine that would have been a pretty juicy trade for Accenture and Infosys to incorporate as part of their consulting practice. But I think there was also some question at the time of what exactly would they be auditing? What does that mean? Does this potentially introduce some risk of like us leaking corporate secrets as part of this process? And in general, it was fuzzy as to exactly how to be enforced. So they got rid of that too. But I do think the theoretical question of AI auditing, or like maybe the potential for AI auditing to become a big industry, is absolutely ripe, even without legislation to do it. Like, I think companies are going to want that done themselves anyway.
Oh yeah, man. I mean, I imagine that there's two possible solutions. One, old existing auditing firms and consultancies like McKinsey and Bain kind of step up their game and say, okay, we're going to adapt to the times and we're going to basically create a brand new suborganization, a subdivision that specializes in highly technical auditing that includes something like red teaming that we perform for companies. Or they're not going to be able to keep up with the times. And it's going to be these brand new consultancies or these brand new like auditing firms that are going to spring up. And I don't know which one I'm more excited about. I don't know if I'm excited about either, frankly. I mean, I'm a little hesitant overall. I don't know what this would look like in practice for it to be done well is an open question mark what this actually looks like. You would basically need to have a company give someone else access to their weights and really play around with the internals at a very deep level that I think only few people have the expertise or the time to really perform. This seems like it would be like a months long process for a company to do this well, but almost certainly we're going to see some version of this spring up, I think, in the next 2 years.
I think so too. I almost would put my money on this becoming part of the standard set. This is a new ISO regime that's put in place as to exactly how you subject your models at like what different tiers. Anthropic has tried to do this, but there are levels of AI risk, like given the capabilities of the model, cyber
Yeah.
risk,
What we were
biological
talking
risk,
about
like that
last
kind of
week
thing.
or
Yeah,
last time. Yeah.
yeah. I think they've tried to create their own internal regulatory regime. Wouldn't be surprised to see something like that adopted across the industry, maybe by legislation, maybe just by shared practice across the frontier labs. If that happens as part of an external company or not, I don't know. I think my experience with people who come from the outside in on these things is that they're really good about sharing their own expertise that they've learned, but they very much can't get up to speed as to company practices quick enough to like really be productive on the order of a few months. And I think that would make it hard.
What if Anthropic does this for other companies? Is there any model for that? Or maybe one of these sort of like interpretability companies? Have you heard of Goodfire? I think it's like the
Hmm.
startup in the Bay that does mech int, I think, sells like a mech int solution where you can give it your model weights and it'll help you understand like what's happening in the internals of the model. Maybe something like that. Like maybe Anthropic can open up like a subdivision of its mech int research team that does this sort of red teaming analysis, like really in-depth model level, weight level analysis of the model for other companies. Like they
Yeah.
have this expertise. They have these research scientists that are cracked at figuring out like what neurons activate what sort of behavior in the model. I could see them just like doing it for other companies, you know?
I think realistically, this is the lucrative part of interpretability research.
Totally. Yeah.
I think, do I care what's happening in these neurons? Yeah, from some theoretic, it's like intellectually curious about what's happening with these neurons. But if that doesn't push the needle on the model performance, you can see how it can be deprioritized. I think the real thing is it can potentially unlock what their risk factors are. And if you have full control over the model, in fact, sometimes you need full control over the model or to be able to freeze these neurons or activate some intentionally in concert with other ones to really be able to unveil some of these issues that are downstream. Or maybe, we'll just create some agents. Maybe Anthropic will roll out those agents that they were developing to do some of the stuff automatically, and that will become the industry standard. I think that's almost as likely to happen as anything else.
Yeah, absolutely agree. For a longest time, it feels like the whole mech in stuff was a fun little puzzle piece that some people were working on the side. It was kind of like the weirdos at the playground doing their own little thing. And now they're coming more and more into the like in group of important research. And
Oh,
now
yeah.
it's clear, okay, hey, this is actually legit. How can we now make a business around this? I think that's one of Anthropic's main questions. We've invested so much money into the mech in stuff. How do we reap dividends out of this? So big questions, dude. Okay, so I want to end this ep, Pierce, by talking about why Newsom vetoed this bill. So we talked a little bit about how the new SB 53 is like a pared down version of SB 1047, so last year's bill. This is what Newsom said, though, when he vetoed the bill. He said that he vetoed it because it is a, quote, solution that is not informed by an empirical trajectory analysis of AI systems and capabilities and fails to take into account whether an AI system is deployed in high risk environments, involves critical decision making, or the use of sensitive data. So, in other words, I think what Newsom is trying to say here is basically the concern here is not that we have to regulate models that cost a certain amount of money to train or that require a certain amount of compute. I think what he's saying is that this first bill, wasn't effective because even a small model in certain environments and that serve certain functions can have a lot of harm and can cause bad things to happen. So it's not enough to just say, okay, we got to regulate the big models. It's all models that suffer from this.
I think he probably just didn't want to pass the first bill, and he wanted a bill that looked more like the second version of the bill, which is why he was trying to come up with some excuse to not just make it
Oh,
seem
okay.
like,
The
you
cynical
know,
take. I like it, dude. Okay.
who knows? But I think that as with any politician or like the act of politics, you're trying to back into the decisions that you might believe philosophically and couch it in political language. Like that kind of is the act of a lot of politics. So I think in this particular case, I think he's kind of true, he's kind of not. In the sense that I agree with him. I think where you deploy these things matters quite a bit. If you use some AI model that's going to deny insurance claims, it's probably bad, right? Because if there's any bias in the system, literally whatsoever, that affects people's lives and livelihoods. And it might be prejudiced in some way based on sex or based on race. And you really don't want that kind of operating in the wild, even if it's like the most frontier of frontier algorithms. There's that question of deployment too. I think there's also just a question of, it seems clear to me that the next generation of models that are small are going to be very performant. Maybe not as performant as these big ones, but like the interesting research, I think the ones that like get us both going are as much on the small model regime as on the really big one, because it forces more interesting architectural trade-offs or like train time scheduling
It's hard to
trade-offs.
research. Small models are hard to train, man, and a lot of the hard, interesting research, the stuff that really pushes the field forward comes from researching small models, I think, rather than researching big models. Yeah, so
Yeah.
totally.
Yeah.
Plus
So
one on what you're saying. Yep.
I think because of that, if you're purely architecting a bill and you're saying this is going to be our regulatory regime around AI and it's going to be pegged to some dollar value of compute or some amount of flops, what happens the second that, DeepSeek comes out or the next version, some new frontier model comes out with again, state of the art model, but way smaller than all the other ones, trained on way less compute than the other ones. You can imagine companies, if they really don't want to be subjected to these laws, they just stop training right before this flops cutoff really occurs. Like the second
Yeah,
you're drawing
totally.
a line in the sand for these things, I think you're necessarily opening the door for people to circumvent what those lines are.
Yeah, so let's train for 10 to the 26 minus one flop.
Literally. Yeah,
Yeah.
literally. It's also all self-reported, right? There's no like central bookkeeping for this stuff.
Yeah.
So I think Newsom's definitely right. Another part of it that was very real was the original bill was very aggressive. And this is a very key California industry. And I'm sure Newsom is thinking to himself, we want to keep the tax base in the state and we want to keep these companies in the state. So let's try to maybe find some pared down compromise that will still be palatable to the state legislature, but also, be palatable to these other stakeholders. Wouldn't
Yeah,
be surprised if that's what happened behind closed doors.
hot take here. What if OpenAI, Anthropic, Google, and Meta are secretly super happy about this bill?
Okay, tell me more.
Well, frankly, it makes it a little harder, it makes it a little stickier to break into the frontier lab space. If you're, I don't know, Amazon or something like that, or Apple, right? And you're trying to develop a really big frontier lab. Okay, so you have to train these big models, but now you also have to spend money on setting up your, mech int team and your analysis team and your safeguarding team and your red teaming team. All these things these existing companies have already basically done. Like Anthropic is the leader, but yeah, OpenAI has a red teaming team. Google, Meta, same thing here. It just makes it a little harder to like break into the space, but the penalties aren't so harsh that if a big frontier lab violates them, they're, bankrupt. Like it's only $1 million, right? For them, that's nothing. So I don't know. If I were Sam Altman right now or Dario, I wouldn't be too upset. I would actually maybe be a little happy.
I'm sure there's some parallel to how all the social media companies for a while were testifying in front of Congress saying, please legislate us. You know what I mean? We would love to be able to operate under some regime of legislation. Now, I don't think they were saying that to say, we want to be torn down and we don't want our revenue bruised by virtue of this legislation. But it's, these companies have to make pretty hard decisions every day that they more or less fully own. Facebook changes its content policies of like how it does moderation. That's pretty much exclusively a Facebook decision for them to win or lose on. And there are no right answers. So I think part of government legislation, why companies like it, is to say, we would rather just defer that. If anyone asks us about why we're doing one thing versus the other thing. Well, the government just made us. And that kind of ends the conversation there, you know? So
it's a form of regulatory capture, basically. Or like regulatory.
So
yeah.
I think what I'm a little bit more concerned about, again, on this data side of things, is depending on where we fall around like copyright law, that big decision, the 1.3 or $5 billion settlement with the book authors. I think things like that impose a cost in the billions versus in the millions for things like this serve a lot more to cement the lead of the frontier labs because they, again, have revenues and then have funding in the billions of dollars. I think at least for smaller organizations, by the time that you're really talking about having the capital to spin up a compute cluster that can do these 10 to the 26 flops, you already have funding in the hundreds of $1 millions anyway. So if you have to spend a few millions on red teaming or on auditing, like that's just the cost of doing business of training a frontier model. I don't think that that's going to impose things. I think once we start ratcheting up the fees, maybe you need some license at one point to actually do this frontier research. If that starts getting into this like hundreds of millions or billions category, I think that's probably the dollar figure that would stop innovation a lot more than what we're seeing here, where compute, again, is still the main bottleneck and the main cost of training these systems.
Or just saying 10% of the pre-training cost. I think that was actually a pretty good number, right? If in the future, if we're not spending 100 million but $1 billion, then 100 million then is maybe the right amount to pay in fines, right? If you violated some of these provisions or one of these laws. But hey, I think the TLDR is that this is a great starting point. I imagine that we're probably going to see more of these sorts of laws come up. Actually, as I'm speaking, I remembered one thing. There are actually local city or county level regulations around AI. This law, I don't know how it works, but it supersedes all of those. Okay, so whatever your local city was doing, if you lived in Sacramento and Sacramento had an AI law, okay, well actually now this thing supersedes that. So this is the law of the state of California now.
This is the law of the state of California, which then really raises the interesting question of what's going to happen on the federal level, if any. Because if that then supersedes California's law,
yeah, who knows? And who knows if there's appetite in the Trump administration to look at this sort of regulation, So exciting times, man. Good time to get a law degree,
Good time to start a podcast, Richard. What are you talking about?
Good time to start a podcast. Exactly, dude. That's what we're doing here. Well, dude, as always, great conversation. Learned a ton.
An absolute honor. Same. This was a fun one.
Yeah, awesome, man. All right, buddy. Well, have a great weekend. I'll see you on the flip side.
You too. Talk Tuesday.
All righty, buddy.
Bye.
Bye.